Hi, everyone. Welcome to the FANAC Fan History Zoom series. Our March 2026 episode is talking to Alex Moy, who is an artist and a fan historian who has an unusual way of presenting fan history. So I'm going to grab the screen and I'm going to show you a couple of images of the kinds of work that he's doing, and then I will take those away and let Alex talk to us and tell us a little bit about what he's got. So you should be able to see one of the early pages on science fiction fan history. We've got Hugo, and represented in quite an unusual way. Aubrey McDermott, who was involved with one of the first fanzines, and Ray Palmer. And you can see on the bottom amazing stories, which I'm glad I got in since it's the 100th anniversary of when it appeared on the newsstands. So that is the way that Alex tells history. So Alex, thank you for joining us today.
Of course, happy to be here.
So you want to start out by telling us what got you involved in science fiction?
Sure. I was trying to think about how I got into science fiction. I feel like it must be my parents. Both my parents, if you actually look up the patent of the collapsible lightsaber tool, that's actually my parents' invention. So I grew up in a household full of Star Wars props and stuff. I believe my parents were friends with Lucas. We lived in the Bay Area, so that would kind of make sense. So I grew up in a Star Wars household, but I think my personal entry into science fiction as a '90s kid was actually the Animorph book series. Um, so I definitely got into, I think, science fiction fantasy that way. And it was really when I was at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. I joined the HOPSFA, which is the Johns Hopkins Science Fiction Fantasy Association, and that's when I got involved with John Con and eventually started attending Balticon. And I've just kind of been loosely involved with science fiction. I'm one of those people who say I have a million ideas for science fiction and fantasy short stories and novels, outline them, and just never finish writing them. So that's kind of my entry in early years in science fiction.
So you met other fans through the university science fiction group. What was your first fanish experience?
Hmm. My first fantasy experience, I think it was actually my first con, which surprisingly was San Diego Comic-Con. Just seeing the masses of all the different fans. But I think really my first fantasy experience was probably so Baltimore. We were very, very privileged to have a lot of different conventions. I think it was Balticon, but specifically Otakon, the anime convention in Baltimore at that time, where it was a massive convention center with thousands of attendees, but they had separate meetups and programming tracks for specific fandoms and niches. And it was there when I got to really, really see different dedicated fandoms for different groups. And that was probably my first fanish experience. And that got me into things like wanting to cosplay and draw fan art.
You're clearly an accomplished artist. Um, can you say something about your artistic influences? What inspired you to start doing this?
My both my parents are artists, but I'm that kid in class where everyone says, "Oh, it's the art kid." I just been drawing. I didn't really have any formal lessons when I was a kid. I just like drawing. So there's no specific influences when I got started. Um, Even though I was studying biology at Johns Hopkins, I took every art class Hopkins had to offer and got straight A's from them. So they even joked if they had an arts minor, I probably would be the first to receive it. But my influences, especially with comics, if you notice, my comic is more of a black and white style. So a lot of my influences for the comics are artists like Charles Burns, Darwin Cook, Craig Thompson, and Michael Chow. So I really like that black and white line art aesthetic.
Okay. So,
Oh, Alan Moore specifically, though he's not an art, though he is an artist, but Alan Moore specifically influenced my entry into comics fandom as well.
okay. So you've got there are two big things I know about you, and I'm sure that there's more. But one is about your convention history, and the other is your science fiction history. What did you start with? How did you get started on it? Why did you get started with it? Tell us all about it.
Sure.
And
Oh, sorry.
no, I was going to say,
Okay.
my voice may give out, so I
Oh,
will, I will ask you to do most of the talking.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I'm just for everyone coming in. I'm just coming off of a congestion myself. So I was even congested last night. So I do apologize if my own voice gives out. So science fiction history was mostly just because I was initially interested in con history. So I'm weird in the fact that I like niche histories and I want to write about. When I was in high school, I went to a military academy and it was about to turn 100 years old. And I got me really interested in the history of that military academy. So I wanted to write a history book about it. But to write a history book, I realized, oh, I have to know about just this general history of military schools in the United States. And surprisingly, no book was done on the topic. So I ended up just writing that book. And that kind of followed me through all my other interests, like the Japanese visual novel medium and convention history. So, living in Baltimore, like I said, I was very fascinated that Baltimore had this wide range of conventions from Balticon to Olicon, Baltimore Comic Con, and even BronyCon, which was the largest My Little Pony convention at that time, as well as various Star Trek conventions and even hosts of Worldcon a few times. So I thought, oh, it would be fun just to write a history on the conventions of Baltimore. But when I realized all these different conventions belong to at what was supposedly separate fandoms and separate bubbles, and that there's no unifying history connecting all these conventions together, and that there's no shared universal language for talking about conventions across these different conventions. I was like, okay, I should just research the history of conventions to begin with, just so I could write this book. And this started back over a decade ago, probably 2011, 2012. And originally, I was just going to write a history book on just cons in general. And that ended up being such a big task that I kind of put that on the back burner and started working on a lot of smaller projects. But that just got me interested, especially once I made the connection that no, cons are not in their own individual bubbles. All these fandoms that like to see themselves as separate, like Trekkies, anime, furry, they're all connected. They all came from a shared history. And that what really got me interested in wanting to show fandom is and the convention scene is all one giant history, one giant family tree together. And so it was through there that of course, made me interested in early science fiction fandom because as we kind of see both Worldcon and the golden age of science fiction coincided in the same year. In fact, the very same month, July 1939, is when that first Worldcon and the golden age of science fiction started. So I thought, okay, so there is a much interesting connection between science fiction fandom and conventions. And the fact that science fiction was the catch-all term for all pop culture, all non-literary pop culture at the time period. Because now when we think of science fiction, we think of a space opera, time travel. But back then, during first fandom, science fiction being the including comics, anthropomorphics, fantasy, sword and sorcery. The fact that science fiction, I could say, it's like the progenitor fandom, the progenitor genre of all these different smaller fandoms. I thought was
You,
very fascinating. So
you're
that's what really got me on the track of looking at the early history.
you are not going to get an argument from this group about that. We all believe that too. So you've said some things that I find really interesting. that what you felt the urge to write a history about the school you were attending. Is that I know people that have the urge to spread the news. We all have friends that call us whenever there's bad news to tell and all like that. And I have uh, friends that have done science fiction newszines, but you have the urge to write a history book. Are you
Yes.
self-publishing these? I took a peek on Amazon. I didn't see it, so I'm wondering.
Yeah, a lot of my I try to keep my it's actually I'm my worst promoter because I keep my personal name separate from my pen name and artist names and alias names. But the history book I wrote ended up being butchered by it was picked up by Arcadia Publishing and History Press. It was originally published under the title West Point of the West. It was History of the Army and Navy Academy. Um, so that was the first book. Initially, it was going to be self-published, but when they picked it up, they kind of just cut off the first half of the book and just turned it into a book about the history of San Diego military schools. Um, but yeah, that I don't
Okay.
know. That's my niche interest. At this point in time, it's I have ideas for books. I just don't have the ability to really finish a lot of projects I work on. So I think a lot of them are just kind of being self-published. But the main one was picked up, and I'm hoping, assuming I finish all these next few projects, I do get published with traditional publishing. If not, then I think the community has been at least very supportive in the last few years. Though the original convention history book I was working on, I tried to get it funded by Kickstarter a few times, and that just never funded. So
Yeah, so
I
history is um, a, a niche interest, apparently. Let's see, did you start first with the history of conventions and then do the history of science fiction fandom? What was your first thing?
Definitely conventions. In fact, I didn't even know much about the early science fiction fandom or even first fandom for the longest time because I know we have this fan encyclopedia available now, but back when I was doing this a decade ago, I think it was still very, very young and not coming up on a lot of search engines. And even all the citations was not available, like the FANAC project that's scanning all the fanzines. None of this was available when I started. And it wasn't only until I think it was really the Worldcon in DC, DisCon, just that was about 5 years ago when I finally got to talking with other individuals who've been interested in history. That's where I met the Ritters, and they published their first fandom experience books. And that's really the first time I got to see, okay, all the stuff that was theoretical, because I knew things like, okay, the first cosplay was at Worldcon. Worldcon was 3 days. It was this, it was that. There was claims that Leeds had the first convention, that Philadelphia had the first convention. So that was like I knew like the brief like the fact and trivia, but I didn't know the actual information behind that. And once I started looking at a lot of these early zines, reading all these fans, reading Sam Moskowitz, and all these other historians' works, that I was able to piece together and look at early fandom, saying, okay, there's interesting history here, but there's also interesting drama. Um, Especially during that first period before that first Worldcon, realizing, okay, even though fandoms have existed before then, there's the Sherlock Holmes fandom and Jane Austen fandom, like the modern concept of fandom really emerged with science fiction. And the fact that in the 1930s, these young kids and didn't even know what the purpose of fandom was, I thought was a fascinating topic, the debate of what fandom should be, with the Futurians on
Yeah,
one side,
it
new
should.
fandom on the other side. Yeah, and it was just so fascinating to see that they were fighting for what a definition of a fandom should be, and that really, really got me interested in just history of fandom as well. Because as as um as I'll probably talk about in some of my later history, especially now that Worldcon's going to be in LA this year, it was from science fiction that all these smaller fandoms emerged from. And I would argue the party floor at these conventions is very, very important for the emergence of fandoms. But you could argue anime fandom, furry fandom, Star Trek fandom, comics fandom all emerge from not just science fiction fandom, but the science fiction convention scene. And I would argue most of these emerge from either the fanzines or the party floors. So thinking about the history of just fandoms in general, you have to talk about the history of science fiction fandom because it's a progenitor. That's why science fiction fandom is called the fandom, while everything else has to be Star Trek fandom, My Little Pony fandom, etc.
Yeah, I haven't drawn the line in my head between My Little Pony and science fiction fandom, but I'm sure that it exists. So you're an artist and you look at everything
Yes.
with an artistic perspective. Um, when did you start to pull your art into your thoughts about history? Or how did you
Um,
start pulling it in?
so I guess some of my art, my a lot of my early stuff I've done for my convention history is the convention family tree, which you might have seen at a bunch of different cons. This is the current version of this, which I released last year at Worldcon. Um, but my background at Johns Hopkins, I was studying molecular and cellular biology with a specific interest in evolutionary biology. And once I started to think about conventions as an evolutionary organism, the evolution you could see which con came from which cons survived, which cons died out, which cons mutated and became new types of cons. I thought, okay, I want to tie that in a way that kind of represents showing that family tree of conventions from the early science fiction conventions, and that's when I kind of tied in my history, and I started to do these panels at a bunch of different conventions. So I do a convention history panel, which is just me talking about all of my research I've been doing. I do this about 20 times a year, different cons across the country. And every time I do the panel, like for the last 10 years, everyone's like, when's the book coming out? When's the book coming out? And it's like, the book is going to be impossible to finish at this point in time. So I thought the best way to kind of at least release some of the history is, you know what, I'm an artist. I've been trying to publish comics for a while now. Why don't I just turn at least the early history, so the first 10 years from 1929 at the formation of the Science Series, the first fan club, to 1939, that first Worldcon in New York. Why don't I just turn that first 10 year into a comic series? And that's kind of where I decided to bridge the gap between that and just combine my interest in history with my artistic skills just to start the comic series. Currently, it's called The Wrath of Khan. I might change it, but I like to play on words. And you might notice it's also done in anthropomorphic style, and that was a way to try to tie in a bunch of different elements because funny animal comics and were a big part of a lot of early comics and science fiction fandom as well. So anthropomorphic animals, funny animals, the animal comics, and that also led into the furry fandom as well. So just the idea, okay, I why not represent the early period with different animals as well, just to kind of tie all these different traditions together. And so it's like instead of drawing humans, which after a while it's going to be boring just drawing the old same white males again, especially during the fur period of first fandom. There's not as much diversity, so it's like okay, drawing them as different animals might be fun. So that's kind of how that project got started.
Um, when you made your convention family tree, how did you decide what the first convention was? What's your criteria?
So it's funny because for the longest time, I would argue that first Worldcon in New York City was the first convention. And I know even when I was presenting this at science fiction cons, the a lot of the old guard would argue it was Philadelphia, it was Leeds. Some people would even randomly argue the Bazaar in the Victorian era or the National Book Convention in the 1800s was the first convention. But as an evolutionary biologist major at Johns Hopkins, I liked it's my idea of what is the first is not what came first, but what started a specific formula that all the other cons kept. So what is the DNA? So I like to say it's that first World Con because it has all the hallmarks of all the different cons. So if we go to any con around the world now, you go to a giant San Diego Comic Con, you could go to a Star Trek convention, a furry convention, a Doctor Who convention, My Little Pony convention, even a video game convention. What is the connecting DNA? What do all these different cons have? And when you look at it, it's what Worldcon started. Worldcon was the first 3 day convention. It had a guest of honor. It has a lot of the templates that we now know. So the banquet, guest of honor, the charity art auction, first cosplayers, which cosplay wasn't coined until the 1980s, but what Ackerman and Moroyo were doing during this period. So if you look at all this, and then the second Worldcon in Chicago had basically what we accept as the hotel model, and almost every single convention before they explode into the convention center started as a hotel block model convention. So I argue Worldcon was the first convention by that criteria because if you look at the DNA of every single convention today, you could trace its roots or its templates back to that first Worldcon. However, I definitely am acknowledging the early 1 day conventions that led up to Worldcon because that first impromptu convention in Philadelphia, Leeds, and especially the early Easter conventions and the National Science Fiction Convention, they were the 1 day template that paved the way to that first Worldcon. But definitely, I would say by the modern definition of conventions, it would be that first Worldcon since that is the DNA template of all future cons.
Did you get a chance to meet anyone that was at that first Worldcon?
Unfortunately, no. I think the last surviving member, I think it was Bob Mado, who
Yeah,
must have been,
yeah, I think Bob
and
was last.
yeah, and I know there's a few young like kids who like kids of parents who did attend, but they are not involved in fandom.
Did,
So
Dave
I've never
Kyle,
met,
yeah,
yeah, I
Dave
never met
Kyle and
any
Bob
of them.
Nadel just died a few years ago. So that's
Yeah,
too bad. Fandom
yeah, it's a
is
shame.
not that big. You could practically put your arms out and hold all of it, right? It's less than 100 years old. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, okay, I was so enamored of my own question, I lost track of where I was. So you started to make one thing you said was that um, said something about people that were older. Did you get many younger folks coming to your talks, and have you had a lot of response from younger people?
Yes, surprisingly, I think a lot of the younger folks are actually the people who are most interested in the convention history. Because normally, when I started to do this, like definitely, I don't think I was welcomed at the early science fiction conventions I attended because a lot of people are like, what's this outsider doing here? Why are they trying to tell our history? You clearly don't know what you're talking about. I always had that one person in the crowd who was back in the old days saying, you got this wrong, but they won't tell me what I got wrong. I was like, no, please tell me what was wrong because I would like to correct it for the history. No, but it seems like a lot of the younger folks are more interested, but they're mostly interested in their histories, which like I was saying, even though there's been never been a book written on all conventions and generals, and there's never really been books written on individual conventions. So people who are in anime fandom, for example, are very, very fascinated just in learning about anime conventions. Furries are interested in just learning about furry conventions. Trekkies and Trekkers are interested in just learning about Star Trek conventions. So I do get a lot of the younger folks, but they're very, very interested in just their area, which is why I really want to try to get people interested in first fandom in that early period because I think that's where a lot of the fun DNA is. So that's why I've been working on the comic series just to focus on first fandom specifically, just to pave the way for that. But yeah, there's a lot of interests but not specifically in the early period, which is unfortunate. But I've been trying to help promote that. I've been throwing room parties at some cons recently just based around my con history project and trying to recreate drinks from these early science fiction conventions and just show the old zines and the flyers for these conventions and get people interested.
So the interest you're getting is mostly from the convention history perspective. Is that
Yes.
so? Okay. Um, so Tell us about the graphic book. There was a question from Joe about did you use the personalities or activities of the human to determine the animal personalities? I mean, how did you make that match?
Oh, so so actually, it is. I'm putting it in the same world as my. I had a semi-autobiographical web comic in the 2010s, which is no longer online for reasons. But it was basically because I'm a vendor at conventions. I'm an art vendor, so I sell my own artwork, and I wrote a web comic called "So You Want to Be a Con Artist." So it's just kind of me telling stories of sitting behind the table and vending, and in that world, I decided to because I'm also interested in the history of transformation and shapeshifters, and so I'm very interested in the history of werewolves. But each continent has their own major shapeshifters. So in Asia, you have fox spirits. In Africa, you have the Buddha, which is the were hyena. You have jaguars in America. So I just kind of used that template to make my characters. So people who have European descent are wolves, and people who are Asian descent are foxes. African descent are hyenas. So that's kind of how I pick that, or else it will just be, oh, how do I choose the animals for everybody? It will be a little bit hard, but I think that also is a good way to show like how much like I guess the levels of diversity at the time as well. So showing first fandom and all the young kids involved in science series of wolves, but then I have Warren Fitzgerald, who's the only hyena. Then okay, that makes him stand out. So that's kind of how I picked the idea.
It's an interesting thought process that you went through for that. Um, so, okay, let's see. What kind of feedback are you getting?
So a lot of people who don't know the history are interested. Like I said, the first few times I've been trying to present this at science fiction conventions, I have gotten a lot of pushback. My first Worldcon was in San Jose, and then I did the Worldcon in DC in Chicago, and it seemed like I was trying to get as much people to interview as possible, but I was basically kind of treated like an outsider. No one knew who I was in the fandom. No one seemed interested in the project, and they just didn't want someone from the outside to get their history wrong. So it sounded like no one wanted to talk with me. Um, so it was a lot of pushback originally, and then when I was at the Worldcon in Seattle last year, was really the first time people really got interested and wanted to talk with me. And so since Seattle, I've gotten a lot of positive reception, which is great. I've been invited to speak at some universities, and this as well. And even Capricorn invited me as their guest of honor, which was a big honor because I've been involved in conventions for I think 17 years now, and the fact that Science Fiction Con was the first to ask me to be a guest of honor, surprisingly, not a furry con or a comic con, but a science fiction con, I thought was really, really great. So I'm happy that at least there's been a lot of positive reception. And it's like, no, I do want to hear like if I got something wrong, I definitely want to know because some of this is guessing, and as we also know, some of it is also very, very biased history. So if you read Moskowitz history, it's going to be very heavily favoring new fandom. If you read any of the Futurians histories, they're going to be very, very negative against Moskowitz and Sakura's camp. So so it's already history is already
Just
biased there. So if people have more information, I
shocking,
want to know.
shocking, shocking.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Was Seattle the first time that you had the history of fandom to show people?
I've had this since
There, the,
actually I think the earliest version of the family tree
not,
was in actually 2013. So it's
yeah, not,
so it's
not
over
the family
10 years
tree,
now.
not the
Oh,
family
family
tree,
tree.
the history of
Okay.
fandom.
History of
The
fandom. I think yeah, Seattle was probably where it really, really started.
And so my assessment of what you just said is that you had clearly put effort in. You had some sweat in this, some sweat equity, and people were a lot more willing to talk to you and give you time because you were not a gadfly, but you were a serious person trying to do something. and fans have always had a lot more time for the people that do something, pub their ish or what have you, work, run a convention or what have you. So
Yeah.
you overcame that barrier. Um, okay, so there's some questions in the chart that you might
Yeah.
want to address. In the chat, Lex Berman asked if the family tree chart was available online. And I know you had, you wanted to share screens and show some of that. Maybe
Sure.
now is a good time.